authors, filmmakers, entertainment, and all your listening needs. Listen now to Talk Now Radio, where no topic is taboo. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Paranormal Palace. Pardon me, folks. I mean Talk Now Radio. I got so used to saying Paranormal Palace over the years that it gets stuck in my tongue sometimes. But as I've told everybody, I've recently switched to Talk Now. I'm doing variety, so I'm covering paranormal still, but I'm also covering the whole broad wide spectrum of anything and everything that can be thought of in my effort to learn more as time goes on. Okay, now joining me tonight is going to be Nick Redfern, and we're going to be talking about his latest book, Monster Files, which I've spent some time reading over the last few days, and he's got a lot of information. This is one thing I've seen, folks, about Nick Redfern's work every time I read one of his books. As he goes out there and he gets the information that few people seem to know or hear about. I mean, I read this stuff in books all the time. I read it on the internet all the time. And every time I get his book, I still pick up on stuff that I never read before. The man digs pretty deep to get his information, and he always brings the straight facts to the table. I think you're going to be really enjoy this here. It's going to be a real treat for you. I want to remind everybody, if you want to learn more about Nick, you can go to www.nickredfern14.blogspot.com. And for those of you listening at YouTube or iTunes or somewhere, you can come to www.talknowradio.com. Free membership will get you in the chat room. We'd love to have you there chatting and asking questions. And for those of you that want to call in, the number is 832-632-7904. If you have friends that are Mac computers, you can let them know that I've just recently installed a Flash player. I could use some Mac listeners to test it out and let me know that it is playing for them. So, Nick, now that I've said a whole complete mouthful, how are you doing tonight?
I'm good, thanks. How's it going with you?
It's going pretty good here. I think we're close enough together that we got the same humid, hot, wet weather, don't we?
Yeah, actually, the last 4 days we've had nothing but rain here. I mean, last week I don't think it went under 100, but this last 4 days the temperature's plummeted since Sunday, and we've had nothing but, I think we've had maybe half a day when it hasn't rained, and that's it in 4 days. When I say hasn't rained, I mean rained solid non-stop for like almost 4 days.
Yeah, that's true. Same here. And on top of that, I went to Yahoo Weather, and they're predicted for rain all the way through Sunday at least, if not more.
No, I don't mind. I can do with a bit of a cooler temperature. So.
Yeah, it has been bringing the temperature down. I'll give it that. So, getting back to the brass tacks about this here book, what gave you the idea for this here particular, it's like you've been doing a series on the in-depth study on different things here lately, like an in-depth study on NASA, on Area 51 and Area 51 bases, on Men in Black, and now Monster Files. So, well, what's motivating Nick Redfern?
Well, basically, Russ, what it is that, over the years, having done a lot of cryptozoological research, I get snippets of stories here and there on all sorts of different subjects. And over the years, I've got, a lot of snippets and fragments of stories on official government involvement or military involvement in cryptozoological stories. And I began to realize over time that, okay, they're only snippets and parts of stories, but if I was to sort of look into them deeply, what I actually found was that there was more and more strands to investigate and aspects to uncover, to the point where I was literally able to sit down one day and say, hey, if I spent sort of the next year just intensively following up on every lead, every source, every freedom of information potential document, and just see what it uncovers, there's a potentially huge story, and that's exactly what I did. And so it was a case of sort of sitting down and really spending time, turning all these fragments into something bigger and following up leads and finding one person who will pass me on to somebody else and somebody else. And, and then you've got the bigger picture, so to speak.
Yeah, you got a fantastic picture. Now, Lynn Caston was on my show. I want to say it was last week or the week before. We were talking about the Journey to Planet Serpo, and he mentioned in the book and on my show that it's like 25 years before they declassify information, the officialdom does. So if that's correct, and I'm assuming it's the same in England, you'd probably know more than me since you're from there. Is it safe to assume that this is not the end of the story, that as time goes on, more of the documents will be declassified about cryptids?
Well, yeah, I think that is the case. I mean, you can actually, you can use the Freedom of Information Act to get hold of documents that were put together yesterday. You know, you don't have to wait 25 years. The 25 year is supposedly the maximum that government agencies can withhold them before they have to come up with another reason as to why they can't be declassified, and they have to be sort of examined and, you know, determine if they should whether classification should be retained on them. The 25 is the upper limit, but, you know, 24 hours in theory is the lower limit. It's all up to, you know, the agency whether they decide to release them or not. But yeah, I mean, a lot of the papers in the book, you know, they literally go back to like the 1830s and right up to, you know, the last couple of years. I think the most recent ones I've got are Australian files, which date as late as like 2009 or 2010.
Yeah, and one of the recurring themes that I've seen in your book on more than one of these here snippets, as you call it, if you don't mind me paraphrasing here, is the fact that in some of these situations, the government is actually exploiting the paranormal phenomena of cryptids to scare, say, other countries or, you know, other militaries?
Yeah, this is a weird thing, that some of the cases in the book deal with what are clearly, in my view at least, unknown animals that are of interest to government agencies. But there are other examples, and again, this is supported by the official documents, where agencies have used monster mythologies and stories to sort of, as a tool of psychological warfare, to frighten the enemy, particularly superstitious enemies and things like that. And also in the way in which the subject is being used as a cover for military activities too. So, you know, you get a lot of different strands. It's not just the case of government agencies investigating these things. You know, you've got this other angle of actually using the phenomenon for other reasons and highly alternative reasons as well.
Well, that would definitely explain why there's no real serious thing. Because, you know, people talk about you can get in trouble if the government finds out you know too much about this, you know too much about that. You hear people post articles on it, you know, in various places on the web. But yet you never really hear of anybody actually really getting in any trouble. Well, maybe the government don't want anybody getting into trouble because they're keeping a legend alive they want to exploit.
Well, that may be part of it, but I think also, you know, it depends how you release information and what you release. You know, I mean, I'm not somebody who sort of runs around, you know, wildly throwing classified documents here, there, and everywhere. You know, everything I use in my books is material that's officially and legally surfaced through the terms of the Freedom of Information Act. So in that sense, I only use material in my books that government agencies have legally allowed us to see. Do you see what I mean? So in that sense, you know, I'm sure there's probably a degree of, you know, taking notice of who's saying what in the field, but
kind of like the Jonathan Downs case? Yeah,
but I think for the most part, you know, when you're using material that the government's letting you see anyway, but, you know, eventually, then that's a very different scenario, you know, to some computer hacker hacking into classified systems or whatever, you know what I mean?
Yeah, Gary McKinnon.
Yeah, exactly. Like that. Yeah, that's why he ended up in so much trouble, because he broke the law and essentially, you know, hacked into classified systems. So in that sense, you know, he is going to get into trouble. You know, had somebody taken the approach of using the FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act, then, and the government agency says, yes, the files can be declassified, here they are, and they become public domain, you know, that's totally the opposite side of the coin, you know.
It's just a matter that, I guess some matters are probably a little more sensitive than others. You might say a story about a Bigfoot loose in Mount Pleasant, just the name of a place off the top of the head, may not mean nearly as much as a wormhole being discovered in China.
No, that's right. And I think, we also have to remember that as files get older, there's a tendency then for more of them to surface. So that's why often, material that comes through the Freedom of Information Act is historical, because so many years have gone by to where, unless it's really sensitive, that a decision's been taken, well, okay, it's all right if we release them now,
So basically, it's sort of like feeding the public morsels in a way, you might say, just enough sugar lumps to keep them going or interested?
Well, I don't think it's much that. I think it's just that, if a classified program went on in the early 50s, shall we say, hypothetically, but it wasn't seen as overly super sensitive 10 or 20 years later, and then 50 years later, everybody involved is dead, and, the Cold War's over, and the program isn't deemed as being sensitive anymore, then the files can be declassified, I think it's more like that. But of course, it's like, if you look at things like Roswell, we clearly haven't got any files on that, but also clearly something significant happened. So my best sort of guess is that, whatever it was that happened at Roswell, it's still a matter of deep secrecy, and that's why we don't have those files. So a lot of the, withholding is dependent on not just how secret the event was when it occurred, but to what extent it still has an impact on secrecy to this very day,
And that was like 60 years ago, so that was beyond the 25-year period we talked about, so they must have had to reclassify that one.
Well, yeah, what there are things called special access programs, SAPs, where, if you're not in the loop, even if you have like a top secret clearance, you're not necessarily cleared to know what goes on in one particular SAP versus another. And, there are rules and regulations that do allow for the continuation of withholding of files. And, of course, when that happens, we don't know because they continue to be withheld, so it's like a bit of a catch-22, I guess.
Yeah. Well, Lynn Caston was saying that according to Anonymous on the Project Serpil thing, these were up for declassification, or they would not have come forward with them when they did. And he said that the thing is, though, they won't just throw them out in the public eye. The public has to actually write in and request the information before they'll go to the trouble to extract it out of the archives.
Yeah, there's a lot of different areas when it comes to official files as to, the declassification process and what can be declassified. And it's like with the Freedom of Information Act, there are a number of pieces of legislation in there which allow for the continuation of withholding of files, as I said, up to like 25 years. For example, personal privacy, for people, for example, in an old file, like, let's say, for example, one particular agency wants to release, or you want to get hold of a file from one particular agency. Well, if that file names agents in there, and those agents are still alive, or possibly even still working, their names have to be withheld to prevent people finding out who they are and knocking on their front door, and compromising their privacy. That's one angle. If government files contain medical information on people, that's another piece of legislation that can allow files to be continually to be withheld because, again, it's seen as like a privacy violation. And, of course, then you have things like national security. In national security-related events, that's why whole swathes of documents are often sort of, just universally blacked out or whatever.
Wow. So they got actual criteria that they have to go by as well.
Yeah, it's quite a complicated issue, actually, where it's not just a case of you applying for files and the government sending them. They have to be reviewed and studied. And the other thing a lot of people don't know is that, say, for example, let's say hypothetically the CIA and the FBI both worked on one particular program or project. Well, if the FBI's files contain, old documents that were forwarded to them by the CIA and they're in the file, the FBI cannot legally release the CIA documents. They have to refer them back to the CIA and then have them check them over to see if they can be released. So it can be a process that sometimes goes on for years and years.
So if I were to say tomorrow, write a letter to the Freedom of Information window requesting files on Roswell 1945 flying saucer, I'd have a 50-50 chance of getting it, and 50-50 chance of getting it within my lifetime.
Well, it's not even that easy, because you have to be very careful how you word the request. For example, if you said, send me your files, on the Roswell flying saucer crash, well, if it actually wasn't a flying saucer, then technically they don't have to release the files. They have to respond to what you specifically asked for. And there's no legal binding as to how they have to, or why they have to widen the search. They don't. So if they don't have anything technically on, if you say a flying saucer, if they've got nothing on a flying saucer-shaped craft coming down, in 1947 at Roswell, they're not obliged to do a wider search for material. And of course, if you say at Roswell, well, Roswell was actually the base where the debris and the bodies were supposedly taken. The actual crash site is a place called the Foster Ranch, which is a 2-hour drive from the town of Roswell. So, in other words, you would have to be very careful to describe, an event that occurred on the Foster Ranch in July 1947, not vaguely the flying saucer crash of Roswell, because that won't get you anything.
So you would have to add in maybe read the wording from the newspaper clip at the time might be helpful?
Something like that, yes. You have to be extremely careful and direct and to the point. It's like if you wanted to get files on an individual. Let's say, for example, somebody who was in the UFO field in the 50s, like Donald Keyhoe. If you wanted to know if there was an official file on him, you have to not just say, I want files on Donald Keyhoe. You have to explain who Donald Keyhoe is, and you have to prove the person's dead. You either have to find like an online obituary or an old newspaper obituary, photocopy it or scan it, and you have to send that in with your request as well. You cannot just request, unless it's like a really famous person who we know is dead, like Marilyn Monroe or somebody like that. If you can't, if it's an obscure person, you have to prove the person is deceased.
So they make sure they don't get in any kind of legal trouble.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, one of the things that you were talking about in your book that I found like a very interesting theory was we touched bases on it a minute ago, the wormhole idea or the portal idea of Bigfoot and other, Loch Ness monsters being highly evolved and making use out of these types of portals?
Yeah, well, this is sort of the more controversial end of cryptozoology. A lot of cryptozoologists, that's sort of an official sort of fancy term for monster hunters, take the view that, all these different creatures we look for are just normal, regular flesh and blood animals, but ones that science and zoology haven't found, captured, or classified yet, or they actually deny they exist, So in other words, they're just perceived as unknown animals rather than something weirder. Now, my personal view is that, particularly with Bigfoot, I don't believe Bigfoot is just a North American equivalent of like an African Congo gorilla. I think there's something very weird about Bigfoot that has clear, in my view at least, paranormal overtones to it, however we define what the paranormal might be. There are reports of Bigfoot vanishing in a flash of light. There is encounters where Bigfoot's been seen at the same time and location as UFO activity. And what's interesting, as I point out in the book, is that government agencies over the years and military agencies have taken a deep interest in these very sort of high strangeness aspects of Bigfoot stories. Now, they don't certainly, as far as we can tell, follow every Bigfoot story under the sun, so to speak. But when they have these weirder overtones of Bigfoot sort of flitting in and out of our reality, on a number of occasions, both researchers and eyewitnesses have been visited by government personnel, not in sort of a sinister Men in Black type situation, but more along the lines of, we'd rather you didn't talk about this or mention it, and, we hope you'll take us into our confidence and vice versa, but we're interested in these stories and we'd like you to keep us informed. And one of these people was a man who's still active in the scene today, Stan Gordon. And Stan's a very good researcher and author who lives in Pennsylvania. And back in the 70s, he investigated a number of Bigfoot cases where UFOs were involved, and he was visited and contacted by government people, as were some of the witnesses he spoke to. And my personal view is that these things probably sort of flit in and out of our reality via what we call wormholes, and that would explain why, Bigfoot has this sort of strange here 1 minute and gone the next minute aspect to it, where, it seems to be able to elude us, not just conveniently or most of the time, but too conveniently and all the time. No other animals achieve this 100% of the time other than these so-called cryptids, as they're known. So I think the reason why military agencies investigate these creatures isn't so much the creature as such, it's the techniques and the science involved in jumping from reality to reality or from wormhole to wormhole, because anyone who could understand and duplicate and utilize wormhole type technology would have a massive military advantage over the enemy. If you could just predict or open a wormhole wherever you wanted it, anywhere on the planet at any time, that would give you a tremendous, as I said, advantage over whoever else. So I think that's what it comes down to. It's not just a case of trying to figure out what Bigfoot is. That's part of it, but it's more along the lines of how does it achieve what it achieves, and can we duplicate it?
Okay, I've got a question for you in the chat room, but before I go into that, I was going to mention real quick, I've interviewed Lapicertus Kiowani, or is it Kiowani Lapicertus? I think you're familiar with him.
Yeah, he wrote the Psychic Sasquatch.
Right. And he's lived out there in the wild with these, and he's claimed he's actually seen them.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, there's a lot of stories like that. People claiming to have had repeated encounters or sort of psychic messages from Bigfoot and things like that. Now, a lot of cryptozoologists, they roll their eyes at it, but I don't care, the way I look at it is the witnesses are the most important people, and if they're saying, Bigfoot vanished in a flash of light or the creature just dematerialized, we shouldn't be writing these stories off just because it doesn't go along with somebody's worldview that it's just an ape that science hasn't found. So, I'm more than willing to look into these cases because I think there is this weirder overtone to Bigfoot, and I think it will probably be these strange overtones that will solve the mystery if we ever do solve it,
Okay. Now, God's Scribe was wanting to know what you know about Middle Hollow Earth. Do you know if such files on that exist?
That's a good question. I don't know so much if files exist on it, but I've read on this whole subject, I don't believe there's a literal hollow Earth, but I do believe, that some of these stories about sort of huge cavernous parts of the earth where people claim to have seen, the remains of ancient civilizations and things like that. I think there could well be something to that. The stories coming from places like Mount Shasta in California or deep below Death Valley in California. You get things like this all over the place. And actually, there's an author named Walter Bosley, who's also a former military intelligence officer, and his father had an extensive military background as well, and his father was supposedly or reportedly told that the Roswell event actually wasn't an alien event, but it was reportedly something involving like an ancient terrestrial civilization that lived deep under the southwest of the U.S., and essentially the U.S. government found out about their existence when one of their craft crashed. And after studying it, it was determined not to be extraterrestrial, but something from right here. And the more they dug into it, they found evidence supposedly of this ancient culture that still existed in isolated parts of the planet, but deep underground. And Walter's, Walter's a very credible person, and his dad had a highly credible career. The big question is whether his dad was fed disinformation or if it's really true. Was Roswell, an event that really did involve strange creatures, but ones that ironically were from here, rather from out there.
I've heard of something similar to that before. People saying that during the days of Cain, they went underground to escape the flood, but yet they continue to live underground in some of the situations.
Well, there are a lot of, most cultures around the world have ancient stories of sort of magical creatures or beings living deep underground. I mean, back in Britain, where I'm originally from, you have stories of the fairy kingdoms being built under hills and mountains. Now, those stories today have been mutated over centuries into stories of, little creatures with wings and stuff like that, Christmas card type imagery, that sort of thing. But if you go back to the original stories, fairies hundreds of years ago were more like sort of menacing little goblin-type creatures, not unlike the Greys. That's how they're originally described, like, 3 to 4 foot tall, sinister things that would surface late at night and then vanish into the underground again afterwards. So, in that sense, I often think, where there's smoke, there's fire. And when all these different cultures around the world have stories and legends of highly advanced creatures from here that descended underground when the human race started to swarm around the planet even more, you got to wonder if there is more to it than just legend,
Yeah, I've often thought it was really more than legends because there's been, so much of it, and because I've known some of the researchers personally, like Lapis Kiwani. He knows Thomas. God, I used to know his last name, and he's been off the line for so long, I forgot his last name. Hughes. I don't know why I had trouble with that, but he lived right up here north of me, and he also, like Lapis lived out in the wild with them, and they both said the same thing, that these creatures were, psychic, in other words. People talking about personal experiences. I hear tell if you go out to the Hopi Indians or the Cherokee, they can tell you stories once they get to trust you, in other words. And you may have some experience with that.
Yeah, a lot of Native Americans have spoken about, their experiences with Bigfoot, and they view them as sort of, not necessarily not physical, period, but that there's something more spiritual about them. There's sort of, some races sort of view them as, that's something that can straddle our world and like the spirit realm, so to speak, and they can be here in one form and there in another, So, I mean, who knows? But what I think is that the very fact that, government agencies have investigated this weird aspect, the witnesses are talking about it, and Native Americans have this sort of magical aspect to Bigfoot in their folklore as well, then you've got to realize that and put it together. And, for me at least, it demonstrates that collectively there is something strange about Bigfoot. It isn't just, a North American ape that science hasn't found. It is much, much stranger than that.
Well, the one thing that caught me as unusual was when you related or you put Loch Ness Monster in the same category. And this may be a stumbling stone to me because I'm having trouble fathoming a language barrier. I mean, I could see like a Bigfoot coming closer to speaking a common language than I could picture a Loch Ness Monster. And communication is what you base all your technological learning on, in other words.
Well, yeah, I mean, the Loch Ness Monster is interesting because, I don't think we can place it necessarily for sure in the same path as, Bigfoot or whatever. But the reason I mention this in the book is because Jim Mars, who's, one of the world's leading researchers and conspiracy theories and authors, etc., Jim has done a lot of research into government involvement in remote viewing and so-called psychic spying, sort of using the mind to spy on the enemy. And, we know, again, thanks to the Freedom of Information Act, that government agencies in a number of nations, particularly the former Soviet Union, the US and Britain, have all, dabbled in the field of remote viewing over the years to varying degrees of success, and in many cases to extreme success. And Jim, in his book Sci Spies, he talks about how the US remote viewing teams actually remote viewed the Loch Ness Monster and came up with imagery that, sort of classically fits the image people have of this humped creature with a long neck surfacing out the water. But he said what was weird was that on many occasions the remote viewers were watching these creatures in the loch and they suddenly vanished, as if they'd flitted in and out of our reality. And one of the intriguing theories suggested, what if these aren't real animals? What if they're sort of ghosts of dinosaurs or something like ghostly plesiosaurs? Now, if people believe in human ghosts, and people also talk about pet ghosts, well, why not the ghosts of animals, from millions of years ago? So, it's a fair question, but you could also apply the idea of these things suddenly vanishing, that maybe they too, have jumped from one reality to another. Now, I don't necessarily...
iTunes or somewhere. You can come to www.talknowradio.com. Free membership will get you in the chat room. We'd love to have you there chatting and asking questions. And for those of you that want to call in, the number's 832-632-7904. If you have friends that are Mac computers, you can let them know that I've just recently installed a Flash player. I could use some Mac listeners to test it out and let me know that it is playing for them. So, Nick, now that I've said a whole complete mouthful, how are you doing tonight?
I'm good, thanks.
Doing variety, so I'm covering paranormal still, but I'm also covering the whole broad wide spectrum of anything and everything that can be thought of in my effort to learn more as time goes on. Okay, now joining me tonight is going to be Nick Redfern, and we're going to be talking about his latest book, Monster Files, which I've spent some time reading over the last few days, and he's got a lot of information. This is one thing I've seen, folks, about Nick Redfern's work. Every time I read one of his books, as he goes out there and he gets the information that few people seem to know or hear about. I mean, I read this stuff in books all the time. I read it on the internet all the time. And every time I get his book, I still pick up on stuff that I never read before. The man digs pretty deep to get his information, and he always brings the straight facts onto the table. I think you're going to be really enjoy this here. It's going to be a real treat for you. I want to remind everybody, if you want to learn more about Nick, you can go to www.nickredfern14.blogspot.com. And for those of you listening at YouTube or for authors, filmmakers, entertainment, and all your listening needs, listen now to Talk Now Radio, where no topic is taboo. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Paranormal Palace. Pardon me, folks. I mean Talk Now Radio. I got so used to saying Paranormal Palace over the years that it gets stuck in my tongue sometimes. But as I've told everybody, I've recently switched to Talk Now. It's going pretty good here. I think we're close enough together that we got the same humid, hot, wet weather, don't we?
Yeah, actually, the last 4 days we've had nothing but rain here. I mean, last week I don't think it went under 100. But this last 4 days, the temperature's plummeted since Sunday, and we've had nothing but, I think we've had maybe half a day when it hasn't rained, and that's it in 4 days. When I say hasn't rained, I mean rained solid non-stop for like almost 4 days.
Yeah, that's true. Same here. And on top of that, I went to Yahoo Weather, and